Nuts, bolts, and nonsense. Chapter 1. The retirement isn't going to plan. For 38 years, Gerald, Gerry, Hawthorne had built things. Bridges. Overpasses. The kind of infrastructure that thousands of commuters drove over every morning without a second thought, which, as Gerry frequently pointed out to anyone who would listen, was precisely the goal. If nobody notices it, he used to say, tapping the side of his nose, that means I did my job perfectly. He had retired on a Thursday in April, which his wife, Patricia, had declared a day of national celebration. She'd bought a cake. She'd invited the neighbors. She'd made a banner that read, "Congratulations on your freedom," which Gerry had found faintly insulting but had chosen not to say so, because 39 years of marriage had taught him which battles were worth fighting and which ones simply were not. The first week of retirement had been genuinely wonderful. He'd slept until 7:30. He'd read 3 chapters of a naval history book each morning. He'd gone on long walks with the dog, a neurotic Labrador named Douglas, and had taken particular pleasure in not being anywhere in particular at any particular time. By the second week, however, a creeping restlessness had set in. By the third week, Patricia had taken to leaving the house on invented errands. "You reorganized the kitchen," she said one evening, in the tone of someone reporting a crime. "It wasn't logical," Gerry said. "The mugs were nowhere near the kettle. They were exactly where I'd had them for 22 years. That's what I'm saying." She had given him a look that Douglas the Labrador also sometimes gave him, and retreated to the garden. By week 6, Gerry had reorganized the garage, catalogued the contents of the shed into a color-coded binder, and written a 4-page letter to the local council about a pothole on Pemberton Road that, in his professional estimation, had been incorrectly patched and would require resurfacing within 18 months. The council had not replied. He had followed up. "You need something to do," Patricia announced one Sunday, spreading marmalade on her toast with the focused determination of a woman who had made a decision. "Something outside the house. Something that gets you out from under my feet. I'm perfectly happy at home. Gerald, you left a spreadsheet on my desk this morning, rating the structural integrity of our kitchen cabinets." There was a pause. "The lower left hinge is showing early signs of fatigue," he said. "It's a safety concern." Patricia pointed her toast at him. "Hardware store," she said. "There's a Hammonds on the high street." They had a sign in the window. "Part-time. Weekday mornings." "I'm a structural engineer, Patricia. I built bridges. And now you can help people find the right size screws." She took a bite of toast. "Which, frankly, is probably more useful." He had intended to refuse. He had composed quite a good refusal in his head during the drive to Hammonds Home and Hardware, something dignified about maintaining professional standards in retirement. But when he'd stepped inside, hit by the smell of wood shavings and machine oil, surrounded by shelves of brackets and rawl plugs and spirit levels, something in his chest had done a small, embarrassing lurch of recognition. He'd filled in the form before he quite knew he was doing it. Hammonds Home and Hardware was the sort of shop that had been on the same corner for 40 years, and wore its age like a comfortable old coat. The floors were slightly uneven. The lighting was aggressively fluorescent. The signage was done in a font that had been fashionable in 1987, and had chosen to remain so, out of sheer stubbornness. The manager was a woman named Sandra, who was 53, permanently caffeinated, and had the general air of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. She had hired Gerry on the spot, which had been slightly deflating. He'd prepared a full work history, and had given him a green apron with the Hammonds logo on the breast pocket, and sent him to the fasteners aisle. Fasteners? He'd said. Screws, bolts, nails, anchors. Sandra said. People get very confused in there. It'll keep you busy. This turned out to be one of the more significant understatements of the decade. It was not that Gerry had expected his colleagues to be engineers. He'd understood, going in, that a part-time hardware retail position was not going to be staffed exclusively by people with advanced degrees in structural mechanics. He had made his peace with this. What he had not quite anticipated was Kyle. Kyle was 22. Kyle wore his Hammonds apron like it had personally offended him. Kyle's primary approach to customer queries was to say, "Yeah, I think that's somewhere in aisle 4," regardless of the question, and then drift in the direction of the stockroom until the customer either found what they needed independently, or gave up and left. "Did you just send a woman to aisle 4 to find plasterboard adhesive?" Gerry said, on his third day. "Probably in aisle 4. Kyle said. "Plasterboard adhesive is in aisle 7. It has always been in aisle 7. The sign above the aisle says, and I want to be precise here, adhesives and sealants." Kyle considered this. "Huh," he said. "I always thought that said addresses and sealants." Gerry looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" he said carefully. "Would we sell addresses? I just work here, mate." This was, in Gerry's experience, the single most dangerous sentence in the English language. Chapter 2. The First Casualties. His first real test came on a wet Tuesday morning, in the form of a young man named Theo. Theo was 26, employed in something involving computers, and had recently bought a flat. His flat, he explained to Gerry in the fasteners aisle, had a towel rail that was falling off the wall a bit. He had bought what he described as some screws, the normal kind, and had attempted to reinstall it. The rail was now, he reported, falling off the wall more. Gerry looked at the small collection of items Theo had assembled on the shelf in front of him. 3 wood screws of inconsistent length, a plastic wall anchor that was approximately the right size for a shed door, and what appeared to be a picture hook. "What did you use to make the holes?" Gerry asked. Theo brightened. "A regular drill. I've got one." "Well, my dad has one. I borrowed it." "What bit did you use?" Theo's brightness dimmed somewhat. "The drill bit. There are many drill bits, son. The one that was already in it." Gerry breathed steadily through his nose. "What size were the holes when you finished?" Theo held up his index finger and thumb approximately 3 centimeters apart. Gerry looked at the anchor on the shelf. He looked at Theo's finger and thumb. He looked at the anchor again. "Right," he said. "Let's start from the beginning." What followed was a 40-minute tutorial that covered, in order, the different types of wall anchors and what they were for. How to identify whether a wall was plasterboard, brick, or masonry. The importance of a spirit level. Why towel rails needed to be anchored into studs or wall plugs, and not simply into the plaster, which had the structural integrity of a digestive biscuit. And the correct application of filler for the 3 existing holes that Theo had created, and which currently gave the bathroom wall the appearance of having survived a light artillery bombardment. Theo stood through all of this with the focused expression of a man taking a driving lesson after having already crashed the car. "So I want the yellow plugs," he said, at the end. "Yellow plugs, 6mm masonry bit, these screws here. Not those ones, those ones. And a spirit level." Gerry placed each item in Theo's basket as he named it. "And if the wall is plasterboard in that section, you come back and we will start this conversation again." "Right." Theo looked at the basket. "Can I ask, why didn't any of this come in a kit? Like, why don't they sell a towel rail kit with all the right bits already?" "They do," Gerry said. "It's called buying the towel rail." Theo blinked. The towel rail came with all this? There was a pause. "Did you," Gerry said, "check inside the box?" The expression on Theo's face answered the question comprehensively. Word got around. This was, in retrospect, inevitable in a shop the size of Hammonds, where the staff communicated largely by shouting across aisles, and where Sandra had an almost supernatural awareness of everything that happened on the shop floor. "You spent 40 minutes with that lad," Sandra said, materializing beside Gerry in the way she had, like a woman who had been trained by ninjas. "He needed help. Most people need help. Most people get 2 minutes and a pointed finger. Most people," Gerry said, "are attempting home repairs with completely incorrect equipment." "Do you know what he was planning to use as a spirit level?" "His phone. There's an app." Sandra's expression suggested she found this entirely reasonable. "The app," Gerry said, "is accurate to roughly 4 degrees. A 4-degree error over a 60-centimeter towel rail produces a drop of over 4 centimeters end to end. The rail would have drained water straight onto the floor. And now he knows that. And now he knows that." Sandra looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You know," she said, "we run a Saturday morning workshop. DIY basics. We used to have a chap who ran it, but he moved to Malaga." She paused. "It's not paid, the workshops. Just so you're clear." "I'm not really here for the money," Gerry said. Sandra smiled, which she did rarely and therefore meaningfully. "No," she said. "I can tell." Kyle, meanwhile, had become an unexpected source of both irritation and, Gerry was reluctant to admit this, entertainment. Kyle's understanding of the products he sold ranged from patchy to actively fictional. He had once told a customer that sandpaper came in numbers, high is rough, low is smooth, or maybe the other way round. Yeah, one of those. He regularly directed people to the wrong aisle, with the placid confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything, because he'd never checked. He used the phrase, "I mean, it should work," to close conversations that would have benefited from significantly more scrutiny. And yet, there was something about Kyle that Gerry, despite his better instincts, found himself watching with a complicated sort of attention. The young man was not stupid. He was not even, Gerry slowly came to understand, lazy in the pure sense. He simply had no framework. Nobody had ever shown him how things worked or why they mattered. He'd arrived at adulthood with an entirely theoretical relationship to the physical world, able to Google anything and understand nothing, possessed of tremendous confidence in information he couldn't verify, and incapable of distinguishing between things that were probably fine and things that were definitely not. This, Gerry thought, was a structural problem. And structural problems were, at their core, his speciality. "Kyle," he said one slow Wednesday. "Come here." Kyle appeared from behind a display of power tool accessories with the slightly alarmed expression of someone who has been summoned to the headmaster's office, but can't remember which specific incident is being referenced. "I want you to tell me the difference between these two," Gerry said, holding up two different drill bits. Kyle looked at them. "They're both drill bits." "Yes. And? One's bigger?" "One is a wood bit. One is a masonry bit. If you use the wood bit on a brick wall, the wall's harder, so it's slower. The bit will shatter. Possibly spectacularly. It is not, in the strictest sense, a situation you want to create inside a customer's home." Kyle stared at the bits with new interest. "Would it actually shatter? Like, properly? I have seen it happen." "Huh." Kyle turned the masonry bit over in his hand. "Why's it got that weird tip, then?" And there it was. That small, genuine flicker of curiosity. Gerry had been watching for it. "Sit down," Gerry said. "I'll tell you." Chapter 3. Saturday mornings at Hammonds. The Saturday workshop began with 6 people and no expectations, which Gerry considered an excellent starting position. Sandra had put a sign in the window. "Free DIY workshop, Saturday 9 a.m., all welcome," and provided a folding table, 6 chairs of uncertain stability, and a tray of biscuits that disappeared within 4 minutes. The attendees were Priya, 31, who had recently divorced, and discovered she had no idea how to do anything that her ex-husband had previously handled. Marcus, 43, a secondary school teacher who had bought a house as a project, and was beginning to grasp the scale of his mistake. Jess and Anne, a couple in their late 20s who had enthusiastically bought a Victorian terrace, and were now in the grip of what Gerry privately diagnosed as renovation shock. Callum, 19, who had been sent by his mother and was not clear on what he was doing there. And an elderly woman named Margaret, who introduced herself as 77 years old, and said she'd been doing her own repairs for 50 years, but wanted to see what the young people were learning these days. Margaret was, without question, Gerry's favorite. "Right," Gerry said, standing at the front of the group with what he privately recognized was the same stance he'd used to address project teams in his previous life. "First question. Has anyone here ever read the instructions before beginning a job?" Hands. Margaret's went straight up. Nobody else moved. "Anyone read the instructions and understood them before beginning?" Margaret kept her hand up. Everyone else looked at the floor. "That's honest," Gerry said. "Good. That's where we start." The first session covered measuring. Specifically, the catastrophic consequences of not doing it properly. Gerry had prepared what he felt was a tight, 15-minute overview. It ran to 50 minutes. Because Marcus asked what seemed like a simple question about marking out a straight horizontal line across a wall, And this opened a discussion about chalk lines, laser levels, spirit levels, and the deeply human tendency to believe that something was straight because it looked straight, which it almost never was. My skirting board, Jess said, at one point, has a gap at one end of about an inch. Because the floor isn't level. Gerry said. The floor looks level. Floors rarely are. That's what the skirting board is for. It covers the gap between the floor and the wall. Which is why you don't cut skirting board to fit by measuring the floor. He paused. Did you cut the skirting board to fit by measuring the floor? Jess looked at Dan. Dan looked at his shoes. We can fix that, Gerry said. That's fixable. Callum, the 19-year-old who had been sent by his mother, turned out to be the wild card. He had arrived with the checked-out energy of someone enduring a mild punishment, phone in hand, attention approximately 80% elsewhere. For the first 20 minutes, Gerry had written him off as a lost cause, which he later recognized as having been a failure of imagination on his part. The turn had come during a demonstration of how to use a jigsaw to cut a shaped piece of plywood. A purely practical exercise that Gerry had included to show that precise tool use was less frightening than people assumed. He'd done the cut himself first, clean and controlled, following a penciled line with an ease that came from decades of muscle memory. Callum had put his phone in his pocket. Can I try? He said. There had been a slight intake of breath from the group, the way there is when something unexpected happens. Have you used a jigsaw before? Gerry asked. No. Good, Gerry said, which seemed to confuse Callum slightly. That means there's nothing to unlearn. He stood beside Callum and talked him through it. Grip, speed, letting the blade do the work. Following not the blade but a point just ahead of it, like a driver looking further up the road than the bonnet. Callum's first cut was ragged. His second was better. His third was, objectively, quite good. Callum stared at the piece of plywood with an expression that Gerry recognized immediately. Had in fact felt himself the first time he'd seen load calculations work out on paper exactly as they should in the real world. The specific astonishment of making something work with your own hands. That's actually sick, Callum said. It is. Gerry agreed, with complete sincerity. Kyle had started attending the workshops. He didn't mention it, simply appeared on the second Saturday morning, pulled up a chair at the edge of the group, and said nothing. The following Saturday he asked a question about why certain adhesives required ventilation. The Saturday after that he arrived early and helped Gerry set up the table. Gerry said nothing about any of this, which was, he felt, the correct approach. Some things benefited from not being named. What he did do was start bringing Kyle into small consultations on the shop floor, asking his opinion on things and then, gently, redirecting when the opinion was wrong, and more importantly, asking him why he thought what he thought, which was usually more instructive than the answer itself. You said the customer needed a number 8 screw, Gerry said one afternoon. Walk me through that. Kyle frowned. It's a, medium job. Medium screw. What does medium mean? Normal. Regular. Kyle. The number refers to the gauge. The diameter. A number 8 is about 4 millimeters. Whether that's right depends on what it's going into, how much load it's carrying, what the anchor capacity is. Medium is not a specification. Kyle was quiet for a moment. How do you know all this? He said. Like, did you just learn it? Over time, yes. Like, in a book? Some of it. Mostly by doing it. By making mistakes and working out why they were mistakes. Kyle looked at the shelf of screws. My dad's well into this kind of stuff, he said. DIY and that. He tried to teach me when I was a kid, but I just thought it was boring. What changed? Kyle shrugged in a way that wasn't entirely dismissive. I dunno. Seeing it actually matter, I suppose. Like, if you give someone the wrong screw and their shelf falls down, that's... He paused. That's on you, isn't it? Yes. Gerry said. That's exactly right. He said it without elaboration, because overstatement was a structural weakness. Chapter 4. The Great Decking Disaster. And its Aftermath. It was Priya who provided the education's most dramatic test case. Priya had decided, after the third workshop, that she was ready to build a small raised deck in her back garden. Gerry had advised, in what he felt were measured terms, that a deck was perhaps a project for after she had completed a few smaller jobs first. A shelf, a door rehang, something in that range. Priya had listened carefully and had then bought 16 meters of decking timber and a substantial quantity of structural fixings. I thought you said she was starting small, Sandra said, appearing at Gerry's shoulder as they watched Priya's car pull out of the car park, visibly lower on its rear springs than it had been on arrival. I did say that, Gerry confirmed. She didn't listen. She listened. She simply heard something different. 3 Saturdays later, Priya returned. She had the look of a woman who had been through something. She set her phone on the folding table and showed Gerry a photograph of a deck that had, in one corner, a pronounced downward lean, like a ship taking on water from the port side. That post is in the wrong place, Gerry said. Yes. Or rather, it's in the ground at the wrong angle. I measured it. What did you measure from? Priya opened her mouth. Closed it. Your fence, Gerry said. You measured from the fence. The fence is the boundary. The fence is not level. Is the fence level? Priya closed her eyes briefly. No, she said. The fence leans approximately. Don't guess. Do you know the angle? About 5 degrees to the left. The group had gathered, because the group always gathered when something had gone visibly wrong. This was not cruelty. It was solidarity. The recognition that everyone at that table was, in some way, building their own version of Priya's slightly maritime deck. Right, Gerry said. Let's talk about datum points. The session that followed was, by general consensus, the best one yet. A datum point, Gerry explained, was a fixed, known, level reference. The thing you measured everything else from. The foundation under the foundation. In engineering, you found your datum before you touched a single piece of material. In DIY, people almost always skipped this step, measured from whatever was nearest, and then spent considerable time and energy wondering why nothing lined up. Everything connects back to one true point, Gerry said. If the true point is wrong, everything built from it is wrong. It doesn't matter how precise you are after that. Precision built on a bad foundation is still wrong. There was a slightly unusual silence. Marcus said, That's also, like, a bit of a life lesson, isn't it? I was talking about decking, Gerry said. Yeah, but I was talking about decking. But the corner of his mouth had, just slightly, moved. The deck was fixable. It took 2 Sundays, which Gerry had not exactly volunteered for, but found himself committed to nonetheless. Kyle came along on the second Sunday, ostensibly because he had nothing else to do, and proved to be surprisingly useful, largely because he did what he was told without adding creative interpretation, which was a quality Gerry had come to value enormously. Callum also showed up, without invitation or explanation, with a borrowed drill, and a willingness to dig that Gerry strongly suspected was connected to the fact that Priya had mentioned she had a younger sister. But the work got done. Standing in Priya's garden at the end of the second afternoon, looking at a deck that was. He'd checked, twice, and then a third time because he was Gerry Hawthorne, and that was how he operated. Level to within a margin he was personally satisfied with. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel at a retired engineer's part-time hardware retail position. He felt useful. Specifically, irreplaceably, genuinely useful. Not in the way he'd been useful designing load-bearing infrastructure. In a quieter way. In the way of someone who had looked at a gap between what people knew and what they needed to know, and had decided, without fanfare, to stand in it. He drove home in a mood that Patricia, over dinner, identified as contentment. "Good day?" she asked. "Moderately productive," he said. She smiled into her lasagna. "You're going back on Saturday." "Obviously." "And next Saturday." "Don't push it, Patricia." She pushed the garlic bread in his direction, which was her version of saying she knew she was right. Chapter 5. What You Leave Behind. The thing about Gerry was that he did not, as a rule, do sentiment. He had built his career on precision and practicality, on the satisfaction of getting things provably, measurably right. He was not a man given to reflection. He was given to specification, to tolerances, to the deeply satisfying finality of something being correctly done. This made it somewhat awkward that, 6 months into his employment at Hammonds, he found himself, on a slightly gray November morning, straightening the spirit levels in aisle 3. Feeling something quite a lot like emotion. It had started with Kyle. Kyle, who had not yet mastered every area of the shop and probably wouldn't for some time, but who had recently spent 37 minutes. Gerry had quietly timed this. Walking a first-time homeowner through the correct process for filling and repainting a wall without once saying, "I think it's in aisle 4. Who had come in on his day off the previous week because he'd remembered a customer saying they'd be back to collect an order. Who had, just that morning, unprompted, moved the rawl plugs back to their correct position after a delivery had put them in the wrong section. Small things. Specifically, structurally, precisely the right things. And then there was the morning 3 weeks earlier when Callum had brought his mate Jordan into the shop. Jordan was 17 and wanted to make a skateboard from scratch. Gerry had thought, not for the first time in his tenure at Hammonds, "This is outside my job description," and had then spent an hour explaining wood grain, flex, and the correct application of glass fiber cloth for the underside reinforcement, because the principles were the same. They were always the same. And Callum had stood there the whole time nodding along, with the expression of someone who was proud of something, which, Gerry thought, was probably the strangest development of the entire enterprise. Then there was Jess and Dan's Victorian terrace. They came in most Saturdays now. The house was, by all accounts, approximately 40% less of a structural hazard than it had been in July, and while Gerry would not have phrased it in those terms to their faces, they were learning to make decisions instead of just making guesses. They had acquired a spirit level. They had, more importantly, acquired the habit of checking. And Priya's deck. Priya's now perfectly level, correctly jointed, properly sealed deck had been mentioned in a neighborhood Facebook group in the kind of glowing terms that caused 3 of her neighbors to turn up at Hammonds the following Saturday morning, asking when the next workshop was. Sandra had quietly moved the workshop to a larger space. The moment that undid him, if he was being honest with himself, which he generally was, since dishonesty was a structural problem he had no patience for, was a Thursday in November. He was in the fasteners aisle, as he usually was, restocking the M6 bolts, when he heard a young woman's voice from the other end of the aisle say, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, "You want the yellow wall anchors for that. Nylon, 6mm. Make sure you use a masonry bit, not a wood bit. They look similar but the tip's different. And you'll want these screws, not those ones, those are too short." He turned. It was a young woman, maybe 24, dark hair, Hammond's apron. He didn't recognize her. She must have started recently while he'd been on his days off. She was standing opposite a middle-aged man with a box of picture hooks, and the lost expression of a man who had come in for one thing, and already acquired 6. Gerry watched the transaction complete. The man said thank you. The young woman. He squinted at her name badge. Amara. Turned and nearly walked into him. "Sorry," she said. "Didn't see you there." "No, my fault," Gerry said. "I was listening." He nodded toward the end of the aisle. "That was well handled." Amara brightened slightly. "Kyle showed me," she said. "He's been really good. Honestly, I had no idea about any of this when I started, but he went through the whole wall anchor thing with me in my first week. Made me practice drilling into a test piece of plaster before I touched anything a customer might buy." She paused. "He said an old engineer taught him to always explain the reason, not just the answer. That way people can work things out themselves next time." She said it straightforwardly, matter-of-factly, the way you'd report a useful piece of information you'd absorbed and were now applying. There was no particular drama to it. Just the ordinary continuation of knowledge, moving from one person to the next, the way knowledge had always moved. Gerry made a small noncommittal sound that could have been interpreted as acknowledgement or possibly a slight respiratory irregularity. "Anyway," Amara said cheerfully, "I've got someone waiting in paints. Nice to meet you." She glanced at his name badge. "Gerry." She was gone before he could say anything, which was probably for the best. He thought about it on the drive home, which was becoming something of a habit. Arriving home from Hammonds in a state of quiet consideration that Patricia had taken to monitoring with a raised eyebrow and an offered cup of tea. He thought about the bridges, the overpasses, the 3-lane interchange that carried 20,000 vehicles a day, load distributed according to tolerances he'd specified on a Tuesday afternoon in 1994. Those were real and significant, and he was, in the best possible way, proud of them. And then he thought about Kyle explaining wall anchors to a new colleague and asking her to practice first, because the reason mattered as much as the answer. The thought that occurred to him, pulling into his driveway, was not a profound one. It was, in fact, quite simple and practical, which was the kind of thought he'd always trusted most. The bridges would stand or fall on their engineering. That was done. That was finished. But this, whatever this was, this chain of small explanations and corrected mistakes and Saturday mornings in a hardware shop, this was still going. He had put it in motion, and it was still going, and it would keep going when he wasn't there, because Kyle would tell Amara, and Amara would tell the next person, and one of the Saturday workshop lot would go home and explain it to a partner or a friend. And somewhere down that chain, someone would measure from a datum point instead of a leaning fence, and their deck would be level, and they wouldn't even know why they'd thought to check. That was a structure too, he thought. Invisible, load-bearing, built correctly. He got out of the car. Douglas the Labrador was watching him from the kitchen window, with the particularly intense expression that meant the dog walk was overdue, and accountability was being noted. "All right," Gerry said, to the dog or possibly to himself. "All right." The following Saturday, Gerry arrived 12 minutes early, which was the right amount. Callum was already there, having let himself in with the key Sandra had given him after he'd volunteered to help reset the space. Kyle arrived 2 minutes later with a tray of coffees from the place next door, which he'd started doing in week 3 without anyone asking him to. Priya was there, and Marcus, and Jess and Dan, and 3 new faces that Gerry didn't recognize yet. Margaret arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, as she always did, and took her usual seat at the front. "What are we doing today?" she asked, unwrapping a mint with the efficiency of a woman who had attended many meetings and was not interested in preambles. "Stud finding," Gerry said. "For wall fixings. The principle, the tools, and the common errors." "I've been doing my own stud finding since 1981, Margaret said. "But go on." "How have you been doing it?" Gerry asked. "Knock and listen," Margaret said. "Hollow sounds different to solid." Gerry pointed at her. "Correct. Fastest, most reliable method. No batteries required." He looked around the group. "That's your first lesson. Sometimes the oldest technique is the best one. Write that down." Several people got out their phones to write it down. Callum was already filming, which he did most weeks now, posting clips to a social media account that Sandra had told Gerry, with some amusement, had acquired several thousand followers who had taken to calling Gerry the hardware guy, and leaving comments like, "Finally someone explains this stuff properly. And my dad would love this." Gerry had looked at this information, determined it was outside his area of operational concern, and moved on. "Right," he said. "Let's begin." He picked up a stud finder and turned it over in his hands. A bit of yellow plastic, £9.99. The kind of object that nobody thought about until they needed it and then found completely baffling. He thought, briefly and without drama, about 38 years of bridges. About the people in this room with their improperly drilled walls and their leaning decks and their genuine desire to understand how things worked. About the only real difference between a building that stood and one that didn't. Whether the person who built it knew what they were doing, and whether someone had taken the time to make sure they did. "The stud finder," he said, "works by detecting changes in density behind the wall. It is a simple tool, and like all simple tools, it is entirely useless if you don't understand what it's telling you. So let's make sure you understand what it's telling you. He clicked it on. The morning began.